We're going to be having Llewellyn speak today. Jen is a horticulturalist, biologist, and consulting arborist with Greenberg Horticulture in Caledon, where she works closely with her husband Joel to provide consulting services in tree protection, arboriculture, and plant health. Prior to the spring of 2022, Jen was a provincial nursery and landscape specialist with OMACRA for 23 years. She holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master's of Science in Horticulture from the University of Guelph. She's also an ISA certified arborist, a life coach, and mentor. Jen is passionate about trees, nature, and mentoring, and has delivered hundreds of interactive lectures and workshops across the province. Jen has written extensively for many industry publications, including Landscape Ontario, the Ontario Arborist, and Ontario Nursery Crops blog. She's also co-author of Bug Finder, the ultimate scouting app for nursery and landscape professionals. And if you haven't personally used that app or had a look at it, you definitely should, because it's fantastic. So without further ado, let's welcome Jen.
Hello, it's so good to see you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you so much. We're really getting John to work hard today. So I am going to be talking about something that's very near and dear to my heart. I always talk about things that are always near and dear to my heart, but this one is the microbiome, or even more specifically, the hidden kingdom of fungi. I totally stole the title. You'll see this in the presentation. I'm going to be talking about the kingdom of organisms that is right under our feet, that's right in front of us, that's right inside of us. This magical kingdom of organisms that is so important for the health and life on Earth. Actually, all terrestrial organisms heavily depend on this kingdom. And we don't even see it most of the time. And it's so important. So, as you know, I'm a generalist, I'm a biologist. I dabble in entomology and plant pathology and water quality and soil health and soil texture and all kinds of different things. So I can get so far, and then we all need to kind of work together on this. So my intention of this talk is to kind of stimulate some thought towards this hidden kingdom. In your everyday life, in your everyday job, this talk is going to change you forever. You will not be able to look around the same way, which is pretty challenging goal to have of mine, because you're amazing arborists. And so you're already quite distracted by so many things going on in the urban landscape, in the urban forest. But there's more. There's more. So this is very important to us, the urban forest, the urban landscape, tree canopy cover. And my intention is to talk about some of the amazing research that has gone on to support our better understanding of the microbiome. And before I even get started into this, I should probably mention, as the amazing Dr. Suzanne Simard mentions quite often in her work, that the indigenous peoples of these lands knew these things. They have survived and thrived here for thousands of years. And these are things that we are discovering, and we're scientifically showing the data to support this indigenous knowledge. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. So some of the resources that you have available to you, I'm going to talk about 3 books in the very beginning here that are epic books. And it's kind of funny because I came across each one almost individually, and they all weave together, kind of like tree roots in a group. And Suzanne Simard, she's Canadian. She's from British Columbia. She's actually, her family is a logging family that goes back generations. And she's, of course, done this incredible research, and she's discovered the mother tree concept. Again, she's really, what is she? She's kind of produced the science, the data that supports the mother tree concept, because it's not actually a new concept to us. It's a very old indigenous knowing. And this book is amazing. It's for those of you that can't stay awake when you're reading books, it's on Audible, and the author reads it herself. Audible books are fantastic, but sometimes the readers they get on there are really bad. So Suzanne reads it herself, and she's just absolutely enchanting. Love it. So read this book. You can get a copy at the ISA bookstore. I'm not getting any percentages, by the way, by promoting any of these books. This is another one that probably not as many of you would be familiar with. Merlin Sheldrake, he's a UK mycologist, so he studies fungi and other microorganisms too. His book's crazy, interesting, entangled life. And yes, he inoculated it with oyster shell mushrooms. And if you catch him on YouTube, he actually eats the oyster shell mushrooms growing out of his book. He sautés them in butter. So check it out. Anyways, these are fantastic resources that go deeper into some of the concepts that I'm talking about today. And then here's my hero, another Canadian. This is Keith Seifert, or Seifert, I'm not sure if it's pronounced with a French accent, but he's this beautiful, amazing person. He's on my bucket list of people to meet. He inspired the name of this talk, and his book is absolutely fungal-tastic. And guess what? It's available at the ISA bookstore. So I saw it on the screen when I was sitting outside. Suzanne has a documentary they made about her work. Merlin has a documentary that they made about his work. And I'm actually going to a screening in Toronto in April, I think on the 8th. If anybody's interested in seeing the Merlin Sheldrake fungi documentary, let me know. I'll pass on it's a private screening in Toronto. Keith, not to my best of my knowledge, but I'm sure that's coming soon. But these are incredible resources. They are so easy to read because they're full of stories. We are humans. We're not bots. We are meant to hear stories from our elders that have all this wisdom and have been collecting it over their careers. It's beautiful. So fantastic fungi they've been so pivotal in human health, in so many discoveries. I mean, they're used as antibiotics, which everybody knows about World War II, and probiotics. There's lots of mushrooms. I'm sure tons of people in this room, like I'm preaching to the choir when I talk about things like mushrooms and probiotics and eating live foods and stuff like that. They're used in industrial mycological processes. So ligninase and cellulase are actually, the cellulase is used in making soft jeans. Like it used to be stonewash jeans. They don't stonewash them anymore because it's too expensive and actually really polluting. They use cellulase to soften jeans now. That's kind of cool. Did you know that? Anybody know that? I didn't even know that until like a week ago. This is pretty good. And of course, things like citric acid, which gives that kind of taste to our colas and beverages, also probably not very good to us as humans, so something to consider there too. Incredible, basically finds in antiviral compounds that are showing huge resilience for the honeybee population against colony collapse disorder, which is incredible. And micro-remediation, so the use of mushrooms to clean up things like oil spills. So this is the oyster mushroom. They inoculate it into a straw mat. They wrap a bag around it and they put it in waters that are contaminated from oil spills. And the oyster mushrooms, they actually take up the oil. And it's not that they completely purify it 100%, but the carbs that they make out of that crude oil is much less toxic than the crude oil itself. So it's a huge win. And you've got all these amazing mushrooms, probably not to eat, but to certainly biosequester some toxins and make them a lot less toxic to the environment is very exciting. Microfiltration, microfabrication, they can be used to make plastics, like fantastic. And then something that used to be quite popular in the 1960s was psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So they've actually used psychedelic mushrooms, sometimes known as magic mushrooms, otherwise known as psilocybe, or they contain psilocybin. They actually have been used very successfully to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, addictions, anxiety, depression, so many things, but also cognitive disorders. So when I was a kid, there was a lot of commercials on TV, and they'd have this frying pan, and they would say, here's your brain, and then they'd throw an egg inside the hot frying pan. Here's your brain on drugs, right? You'd be like, whoa, I'm never doing drugs, like never. Well, on the left-hand side of this graphic, this is your brain right now, unless some of you have taken psilocybin and are having a nice trip right now, and you're having an extra special one today, let me tell you, because I'm here and this is gonna be so much fun. So that's your brain regularly. And on the right-hand side is your brain on psilocybin. Look at all those neural connections. Psilocybin has been proven by many research teams across the world to increase neural connections and neurogenesis, increase the number of neurons. Is that important to you? It's important to me. And it's not full-on doses where you're going on a magical journey for 4 to 6 hours. It's micro doses that are sub-perceptible, that are sub-mind altering. That's very interesting. It's interesting to my parents. It's interesting to my aunts and my uncles and my sisters and my brothers and a lot of other people that are younger than me. Now, it's not just psilocybin type mushrooms. It's other mushrooms that don't have mind-altering effects. So lion's mane is another example. You come across this in your job in the woods. You'll see lion's mane on fallen stumps, on things like sugar maples. And they're finding huge improvements in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and memory loss. This incredible research team, so what they do is they'll stack, you can find this, you can actually look for the Paul Stamets stack. Put up your hand if you know Paul Stamets. Oh yeah, okay, I'm preaching to the choir. So he's a famous mycologist in the United States. He's done so much work for old growth forests. Amazing stuff, so just start watching his YouTube videos. So he'll stack lion's mane, a psilocybin mushroom, and then niacin, all micro doses. So you're probably thinking to yourself, why is she talking about all of this? This is an arborist conference. And the first time I gave this talk last year, I talked about this, not in as much detail, but at the end of my talk, I had a young arborist come up to me, a young man, and he said, Jen, I have to tell you something. About 6 or 7 years ago, I started having these really crazy episodes where I would kind of like wake up almost like I was in a dream. And I would wake up and I like someone would say, you did some really strange behavior, you were doing something weird in the middle of the room. It got really bad where I was waking up in car wrecks on the side of the highway and not knowing how I got there. And I would be, all kinds of injuries and stuff like that. And I was finally realized I had dissociative identity disorder, DID, which we used to call multiple personality disorder. And just as an aside, we all have multiple personality disorder. Have you ever said, a part of me, really wants to work on that report today, but a part of me wants to go for a hike? We all have multiple personalities, but for some people, they've had such bad trauma to them in such an early stage of life, like below 7 years old, that their parts split off from each other. And he said, somebody told me to try microdosing psilocybin mushrooms. And he was so heavily medicated that he couldn't really do anything. He never felt anything. He was numb. He just walked through life in a zombie. He was such a young, beautiful person. So I started doing this, and I felt like I was a kid again. I have my whole life back. He microdoses just a couple of times a week. I've managed with my doctor to get off my meds. My life has changed. There are thousands and thousands of these stories, and he said, can you please tell everybody that you talk to about this topic, about my story? And you are the perfect audience for this. So this is a real person. Anybody who wants to follow up with more information or they want to connect with this young man, I'm happy to do that. So I had to tell that story. That's a lot of great stuff, for a kingdom of organisms, and only about 6 to 10% of them have actually been described. So it's like, wait, there's more. And there's definitely more coming. We just need more mycologists in the world. We need more people in this industry, in this research community. So we are lumped in with this whole community, okay? We have fungi that live inside of us. We have a lot more bacteria that live inside of us, but we do have fungi that live inside of us, and researchers are saying they're really important for our digestive tract, our gastrointestinal tract, very important for gut health and gut wall health as well. So if you had to guess how many cells are human in my body compared to how many cells are microbial in my body, what do you think? Do you think it's like 1 to 1? Any guesses? Do you think put up your hand if you think there's more human cells in my body than microbial cells. Put up your hand. Okay, so put up your hand if you think there's more microbial cells in the body than there. Okay, we have a keen bunch. Okay, so you're all correct. That is true. What's the number? Like, how much more? Do you know? Any guesses? 30%. Yeah, 30%. There's a big hot debate on that right now, but the number I'm taking is 30%. And really, it's like the conversion between, it used to be the Canadian and the American dollar, but now it's closer to 1.4. And you know what? As research goes on, I bet that number is going to go up. I wouldn't be surprised. And it's the balance of the communities that live inside of us. And where are the two major parts of the body that we have microbes that we got like lots of them compared to other parts? Yeah, so the respiratory system and yeah, the digestive system. So plants also have a big community of microbes on the outside, on the inside, in their roots, and their shoots, like everywhere. So we call them epiphytes, the microbes that grow on the surface of the plants. And we call the other ones endophytes, the ones that are on the inside of the plant. And so like 150 years ago, they started to classify these organisms and look at them. And they noticed with the advent of microscopy, they'd look at cross-sections of leaves and stems and they'd be like, why is there fungal mycelium in here? Why are there's bacteria in here? There's all this stuff. I was expecting just to find a plant. So they would take out some of the fungal mycelium and they try to grow them on agar plates, and it took like years. They would grow like a ½ an inch a year. It's pretty hard to do a grad student project on endophytes back then, right? Because they only had 5 years. So with the advent of DNA barcoding and genetics testing, they would find that, you know, Pinus strobus is not just Pinus strobus. There's like hundreds, if not like over 1,000 microbes, endophytes that live inside that plant. And they noticed that the plants that had that richer diversity of endophytes, they grew faster, they grew bigger, they had more leaves, they had higher leaf area index, they were more resilient to drought and heat and wind, they were more tolerant of pests and diseases. We're all just these communities walking around. It's these relationships and the balance in these relationships that really, really has a lot to do with it. So it's not just fungi. I have to emphasize it's not just fungi, it's bacteria too. And you know, you've seen evidence of endophytes in your work because you see these barrage zones in the wood. So this is basically two populations of endophytes, say like fungal endophytes that are inside wood, and you know, this is my territory, I'm growing on this side and I need all this lignin and cellulose, and these guys are on the other side going, well, this is my territory. And so they build up this wall, this highly ligninized, that's not really a term, but they build up this wall. They're like, you can't go any further and you can't come into my territory. And these are called barrage zones. And this is that really pretty wood that people make, you know, pots and bowls and all kinds of nice stuff with. But what you might not have realized is some of the fungal pathogens that affect our trees are also endophytes. So Lophodermium, which is a somewhat common fungal disease in pine plantations and pine nurseries, actually is an endophyte. So a lot of endophytes, they live in harmony with the plant. You know, they're getting carbon from the plant, and they're giving back in some other ways. And at some point, somebody decides for whatever reason that it's time to switch tactics, and I need to really more like parasitize you than be this benevolent occupant inside your building. And then that's when the needles start to senesce and fall off, and abscission zones, and the tree is trying to cut its losses with this endophyte that's become a pathogen. But a lot of them are beneficial. So there's endophytes inside spruce, and there's researchers that are doing work on this in eastern Canada. And what they noticed is that the spruce trees with a real vibrant population of endophytes, that they were seeing like significant reductions in spruce budworm feeding. So the endophytes are either making the leaf less delicious, or they produce what are known as mycotoxins, which myco is just fungus, so fungal toxins that when the spruce budworm eat the foliage, it doesn't taste very good, and so they go on to another tree. And they've noticed these kind of awesome trees. And so they'll go in, they'll actually take a rifle, they'll shoot off some of the branches of these trees that are showing this incredible tolerance and resistance to pests, take it in the lab, and then they started culturing those endophytes, and they've isolated some of them. One of them here, which I'm not going to say, I'm not going to try and announce that one. There's too much information. I can't fit any more pieces of data in my brain for the next 45 minutes. But they have associated that with being the one that's producing the toxin that the spruce budworm don't like. So they've taken that into the lab, they've cultured it in these big vats, and the idea is they've inoculated spruce seedlings with the endophytes successfully colonize into the tissue, and eventually when they grow up into the forest, they've got this natural kind of resistance and tolerance to things like spruce budworm. But the problem is it's going to take probably like 50 to 80 years for us to really see the results of how effective this was, because spruce budworms, you know, they go through their outbreak years, and so it's not like every year, and trees take a long time to grow. So these researchers will be long retired and maybe no longer with us by the time we see the evidence. But this is the kind of cool stuff that we have coming on, really back to basics, back to this whole community idea. Has anybody ever heard of Taxol? Yeah, you've heard of. So it's got anti-cancer properties, and it's found in a native plant, Taxus canadensis. It's actually fungal endophytes within the plants that produce the Taxol. And Merlin Sheldrake, he talks about some of the theories in his book, and he actually, puts forth the question, or is it the bacteria living in the fungus that's really making the Taxol? And in about probably 2.5 years, we'll know the answer to that question, I'm guessing. But it's all about the microbiome. It's fantastic. And interestingly enough, unfortunately, but interestingly enough, Suzanne Simard talks about, because she had got breast cancer, she talks about it in her book, and this was one of the chemo treatments that she used to successfully beat this disease. So fungi are as old as the plants on Earth, the terrestrial plants. The scientists seem to really agree that 500 million years ago, when plants started to move from the water into terrestrial systems, they didn't have roots, and the fungi came along to support them with a temporary root system until the plants could evolve their own root system. But they stayed together. They kept that long-term relationship, and they still have it. But if it wasn't for fungi, plants would have not likely been able to evolve into terrestrial systems. And what's really interesting, when you look at root tips and the root hairs, and the area around the root tip is called the rhizosphere. And in that rhizosphere, this root will actually exude liquids out of its system, out of its phloem, which are largely carbohydrates. And there's research that says that as much as 40% of the carbohydrates are exuded out of the root system. That's kind of like the tax rate living in this part of the world. That's a lot. And we don't have a choice. But the plants do. Why would they exude out so much carbohydrate in their root system? Any theories out there as to why they do that? Who are they feeding? The microbes, the fungi. So that carbohydrate is the first signal to microbes to say, oh, there's food here, let's go. Come on, let's reproduce, let's do our thing, let's have a party, let's eat and poop and do all the good things that we love to do. But it's what signals organisms like mycorrhizal fungi, right, which are fungi that associate with root systems of plants, which are very important, and a lot of you know about that. I thought this was a beautiful quote. This is on my next book read. I can't believe I haven't read this yet. Braiding Sweetgrass. I just love that. Plants know how to make food and medicine from light and water, and then they give it away. So beautiful. But I don't think they're just giving it away. I think they're getting something back for it, right? So here's a pine seedling. Is that the whole root system of that pine seedling, or is there something else going on in that picture? What do you think? Put up your hand if you think that's the whole root system of the pine seedling. Okay. Put up your hand if you think there's something else going on there. What else is going on? What is that? What's all that white stuff that kind of looks like roots? Yeah, it's mycelium or hyphae. It's the vegetative part of the fungus. So the mushroom is the above ground reproductive portion, and actually a small percentage of fungi actually reproduce with mushrooms. Most of them don't, so most of them kind of stay out of our sight all the time, which is kind of why it's hard for us to believe sometimes that this kingdom of organisms is so important, right? Because we don't see them, we don't perceive them, but the plants do, and they're really, really important to plants. So there's the original kind of plant tissue root system of the pine seedling. And we know that mycorrhizal fungi, look at the expanse of that extra root system that used to be a temporary root system and has now become this incredible symbiotic partner. 10 to 100 times increased root area to absorb and store water from the soil, to absorb and store nutrients and minerals from the soil and shunt them into the plant. And what do they get back? What does the mycorrhizal fungi get back? Starts with a C. Carbs, carbon, carbohydrates, sugars, all those beautiful things, because they can't make their own. They're not photosynthetic. The plants are. So it's just the back and forth trade information, as well as water, nutrients. And they're a major, major sink and source of carbon. And we're losing tons and tons and tons of carbon out of soils every year with every growing season. And this is an opportunity to put some back in. So they think it's about 92% of plants actually have mycorrhizal fungal associations. And only 6 to 10% of the fungi have been described too. So who knows what that number is going to look like. So for those of you that like to watch movies, put up your hand if you like to watch movies and documentaries. Oh yeah, that wasn't everybody. That was interesting. Okay. I do. This is a great documentary on Netflix, and it's Woody Harrelson who narrates it, who's such a dude, and I just love him so much. And this other guy from the Vampire Diaries, who my daughter was totally in love with about, 10 years ago. And it was amazing. They have all these wonderful people, and they're talking about regenerative agriculture. Yes, it's on Netflix. Has anybody seen this documentary? Oh yeah, look at all the hands. Wonderful. So they talk about things like no-till systems, so not disturbing the soil, planting a diversity of plants. And the whole real big thing here is having as many plants with as many roots growing for as many months of the year as possible. Because we know now, remember that 40% of carbon is going out the roots and is feeding the microbiome, and then there's that huge network of things like mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria, and then there's nematodes, and then there's crustaceans, and there's insects, and there's worms, and there's animals, and they're a keystone species for everything, everything. And they're a major sink for sequestering carbon in the soil, which we absolutely need to desperately do. And of course, root systems do as well, right? Tree roots do as well. So this is what nursery production used to look like all over the place, and it doesn't so much anymore. It's starting to look more like this. All nurseries that I ever worked with in my career, especially in the last 15 years, they really started to cover crop in between crops, and they are using cover crops within rows now. This is NVK Nurseries in Dundas, Ontario, which probably many of you have ordered trees from or at least driven by. Fantastic operation. And they've worked with a consultant for a few years, and they really beefed up their cover crops. So again, there's all that carbon that's going into the soil and getting locked into the soil. And not to mention the benefits that it's having on the tree crops, which are huge, which we're going to talk about. Another documentary to watch, if you haven't seen, has anybody seen Fantastic Fungi? Oh yeah, this is amazing, amazing. The graphics in it are beautiful. Imagine an organism that feeds you, heals you, reveals secrets of the universe, and could help save the planet today. So in this documentary, we have Mr. Paul Stamets, who I mentioned already, and basically talks about the idea of mycorrhizal fungi, which is, it's not a commonly known concept. The average person has no idea about this huge network, this fungal network and bacterial network that's going on under the ground. And so Paul is on there to talk about it. They talk about some of the other benefits of fungi as well, and Suzanne Simard is on there too. This is on Netflix. And of course, she talks about her book and her award-winning research about finding the mother tree. So Suzanne Simard, has anybody ever read the book, Finding the Mother Tree? Wow, there's a lot of people. That's a big book too, so that's a big investment. It doesn't look that big, but when you open it, the font is really small. So it's actually quite a in-depth book. And it's amazing because she actually walks you through her research days and all the work that she's done. So she was involved in the forestry industry as a new grad from forestry, and she'd have to check on the plantations, the replanting, and she'd see these tiny little, spruce seedlings, and they would look so terrible, and they would all be deficient, of course, in nutrients, and she'd wonder, what else is going on there? Because in naturally regeneration forests, they don't look like this. But of course, in clear-cut situations where they've taken out everything, and back then, they took out the alder and they took out the birch. They considered them to be weeds. And she wondered if they actually really served a higher purpose that just maybe the foresters and the researchers and the policymakers just couldn't quite see. So she spent a lot of time looking at root systems. And she noticed that the reforested areas after clear cuts, they didn't have those mycelium growing around the root systems, where is it in reforested areas where they used multiple species, or of course some of the old growth forests that there was some natural regen in them, that they were loaded with fungi around the root systems. Have you ever come across ghost pipe in the forest, usually around late summer? Put up your hand if you've seen this one. Yeah, oh yeah, well, yeah. It's kind of cool. What is it? Is it a fungus? Is it a plant? What is it? Does anybody know? Yep. It's a plant. It doesn't look like a plant, does it? It looks more like a fungal kind of mushroomy. Can it photosynthesize? Can it make its own food? No, it can't. It's got no chlorophyll, no green pigment. So how does it live? That's really weird. So back in the late 1800s, there was a Russian scientist whose name I cannot remember in this moment, but it's not pivotal to the story. He noticed this, and he's like, I wonder if some of the mycelium that they're associating with this plant, and it's getting its food maybe from other plants in the forest through the mycelium. And the other researchers were like, you're an idiot. Why would you ever think something as stupid as that? But he couldn't prove anything because they didn't have the science to be able to look at that. And they laughed at him, and he got locked out of the coffee room for a couple of weeks and stuff like that. And then way into the 1960s, when they invented things like carbon-14, they would load the air around this plant with carbon-14 or some other trees nearby, and they would link it up into the Monotropa uniflora, the ghost pipe. So they were able to actually see that it was getting its carbon from the nearby trees, and it was through this mycelial fungal network. So this is something that Suzanne Simard, she was like, oh, this is, if it happens there, what's going on with our trees? What could be going on? What are those little spruce seedlings needing that they're not getting because maybe they're alone in that plantation? And they call them mycoheterotrophs. So the fungi will associate with trees and different trees, and also this plant, which is kind of cool. So she looked at birch and fir plantations, and she was trying to see what was happening, because everybody was treating birch like a weed, and she thought that it was actually part of the reason why the plants were being successful. And this is a quote from her book, that roots didn't thrive when they grew alone, that trees needed one another. So with her research team and the help of researchers like across the world, is they realized that the birch, first of all, that the birch had bacteria inside them that was fixing nitrogen from the air. So the birch could actually fix nitrogen and contribute nitrogen into the soil and into that fungal mycelium network. Of course, they're fixing carbon, so they're also giving carbohydrates down there. And that the birch was directly related to the fir, and they would actually feed the fir carbon, nitrogen. The mycelial network is what brought it. So as soon as those little seedlings can link up, they were being fed by the mother tree. The mother tree is a bit more of a broader concept, more about older ancient trees. And then her research went on after that to show that bigger trees can feed smaller trees, especially in their own species, but even across, as you can see here. And that old trees that were dying or could sense that there was trouble coming, so maybe there was something feeding on the foliage, it would then just drop carbohydrates into that mycelial network and feed everybody, almost like they knew they were going to die, and so they just like a mother would, right? Giving you all of my resources so that you survive. And that they could do it preferentially to their own offspring. Isn't that wild? These are sentient beings that they can actually sense their own offspring versus other seedlings from another parent tree. And this had never been realized before, and so it really has slowly over time changed a lot of forestry protocols, but still very relevant to our landscapes because we see individual trees all the time, and they are lonely. And we know how lonely they are for things like carbohydrates. They're not having those mycorrhizal associations with other plants nearly as much. This is where I think there could be a lot of research. So Suzanne's research kind of blew up when Nature magazine published her mother tree articles in 1997, and they are the ones that coined the term the wood wide web, which you probably heard of before. So basically that the forest isn't really what you see, it's actually a community of networks. And the fungi are decomposers, recyclers, they're connectors. Plants can send a distress signal to other plants through this mycelial network, and the other plant will receive it in less than an hour. It's like, okay, spruce budworm have hatched. Well, actually, probably not hatched. They've overwintered and they are starting to munch. And so get out your secondary metabolites and your mycotoxins because game on, war is started in the forest. And that soil is packed full of mycelium. There's all kinds of stats that I see different numbers, but there's so much fungal mycelium in the soil, in a healthy soil. And the fungal mycelium is actually an indicator of soil health. So the more you see in there, the healthier the soil. And when we open up our urban soils, we often don't necessarily see this, but there are things that we can do. So fungi are vitally, vitally important for all life on this planet, especially in the terrestrial systems, right? They allowed for plants not only to live, but also to be the dominant life form in terrestrial systems. There would be no plants without fungi. If it wasn't for fungi, we would be tripping over dinosaur carcasses, right? That's the joke. So there'd be no us, because we need plants to live and survive. So what do you think? Put up your hand if you think that plants are the primary source of oxygen that organisms breathe. That if, that's like more than 50% of the oxygen comes from plants. Yeah. Okay, put up your hand if you think it comes from somewhere else. Where else would it come from? The ocean. Yeah, it comes from the ocean. What is it in the ocean that's making this oxygen? Yes? Algae, yep. What else besides algae? Little tiny plants that are unicellular. Phytoplankton, too. Cool, eh? It always makes me think of Finding Nemo. They always have plankton jokes in there. Can't remember the thing. Somebody called somebody a plankton. Anyways, I love that movie. So we have a lot going on in this universe, but I don't think everybody knew that so much oxygen that we need to breathe is also coming from the ocean. So I wanted to put that out there. I was recently at the Museum of Nature in Ottawa. If you ever go to Ottawa, there's an incredible, just the building alone is gorgeous, but there's so much really wonderful information. And it's so weird because 20 years ago, we were talking about climate change and temperatures rising and all that, and people were like, I don't believe that. And now it's like everywhere. It's abundantly clear that we are in changing times. And the future of plants, a lot of people think, is fungi. And the future of plants, like we are physically, emotionally, foodically, definitely invested in the future of plants, because that's our future too. We can breathe, but if we have nothing to eat, then that's no good. So some of the things, plants and other organisms will build soils, and when we go into an urban landscape, it's a very different situation usually. Sometimes it's only like 3 or 4 inches of topsoil that kind of look like that and are supporting life, and then below that is this like bee horizon that, a machine drove over about 6,500 times before they finally finished at that site. So we have a lot of soil compaction. We have really shallow topsoils. So it comes right back to these plants. As many plants and as diverse as possible, right? To be growing for as many months of the year, putting carbon back in the soil and feeding the microbiome, because the microbiome supports all life on Earth, the terrestrial life on Earth, which is kind of where I'd like to keep living. Like, I don't know about you, but I would. And you are out there every day. You are change makers. You are influencers. You are educators. You are so highly educated and educators. And there's a lot you can do here. So I'm hoping that some of this stuff is starting to come together in your brain and you're starting to think about things that you do in your businesses and that you can influence in your businesses as arborists. We add microbes to the soil. We'll add things like compost tea and some other kind of teas and vermiculture type teas that, you can certainly introduce organisms, but they feed on carbon. So we can introduce them, but they're going to eventually die if there's not enough carbon, not enough tree roots in the soil to keep them going, right? To be that manufacturer of the carbohydrates. So why not try adding some carbohydrates into the soil to start the process along? To signal to things like mycorrhizal fungi, there's food here, come land here. Come, what's the word, germinate here and grow into a hyphal thread and maybe link up with a root system. If you feed them, they will come, just like your kids' friends. You have to stop cooking with cheese, right? Otherwise they will never go away. So thinking about ways that we can add carbohydrates, seriously, to the soil to start this process along for newly planted trees. We're going to increase microbes, we're going to increase organic matter in the soil. And for root exudates, and you're welcome to take a picture of this slide for those of you that are like the keener, science geeky, nerdy people like me that need to like have all the details. You're the people that I love, by the way, very much. I love all of you, but you know how it is. And there's a lot of things that are available to us that we can make very inexpensively to signal into that soil that there's food here. And we can maybe start more population. So that's one thing. And using that, as a soil injection system where we were doing deep root fertilizer maybe before, we're introducing carbohydrates and maybe some microbes into the root system directly. And at the same time, we're increasing air pore space, we're introducing channels for water, porosity, drainage, and building microbes and organics in the soil. So wood debris is another thing, of course, a really important part of a functional forest and that healthy community of microbes. It's cute. I've got 10 minutes, it's a big 10 sign, I love that, nice and obvious. So trees fall over, the wood starts to rot, as we know, is the beginning of the decomposition process and the recycling process where those nutrients can then be liberated for many, many, many other organisms to feed on and become, again, part of that web of life. And it's crazy, it just makes me cry when our clients I don't want any leaves. I want a tree, but I want no leaves. I can have no leaves on my patio, and if it drips sap on my car, I'm going to lose it. This is what we're dealing with. Those leaves, those sticks, all that debris, yard waste, is the most nutritious, beautiful, that creates and supports the microbiome in the soil and also insulates the soil against climate change. We have to really do a better job at being positive change influencers, I think, in this industry. We have clients that do the same thing. I want my forest to look pristine. I want to see the bare soil. That's not what forests need. It's not how they naturally work. So if we can mimic this as much as possible in some of our landscapes so that we can stimulate this, we can support this keystone group of organisms, and that's fungi. And this is Paul Stamets. It's this keystone organism, the one that facilitates the cascade of other biological processes that continue to remediate habitat. So the fungus feeds on the wood, the nematode feeds on the fungus, the insect feeds on the nematode, the crustacean, the animals, and everything above it, and the plants, and liberates those nutrients for all of them to grow. So adding wood chips and sawdust, especially deciduous species that break down quickly, and we're not talking about a lot here, and it can be surface or it can be sometimes incorporated. If you're incorporating it and surface application, you really have to be mindful about bringing back what nutrient. If you're going to be adding carbon to the soil, what other nutrient do bacteria need to break down that carbon? Nitrogen. You're going to have nitrogen deficiency, which is yellow, and it's in the oldest growth, right? So that's something we have to be mindful of. And we're talking, maybe 10% of a soil, potentially, or less. But it's that starting point, it's that carbon, it's that food source. The microbiome is starving for carbon in our Ontario soils. So if we can start the process. And wood has a really, really high carbon to nitrogen ratio, so we really have to be mindful of wood. And bark. Wood is higher, bark is a little bit less. Yard waste would be even less than that. And avoiding some evergreens like juniper and thuya because they actually have antifungal properties in the wood. So we use a lot of air spading in this industry to do all kinds of things, but we do also vertical mulching on some properties to alleviate soil compaction. And it's another opportunity to introduce carbon into the soil in the form of wood waste products and start creating that beautiful microbiome for fungi and other organisms to live and feed and raise their families, which is not really accurate. This is quite often just starts with one organism. Kentucky bluegrass, is this a native plant in Canada? No. But it's been quite successful. It likes our cool springs and falls. It hates our summers. It goes dormant. And it's a major competitor. And grasses, typically they have a different kind of mycorrhizal fungi associated with them that they don't really marry with trees, a lot of trees. So they're not really good partners. And they steal a lot of water and nutrients away. So getting people to kind of remove them from root zones. This is just a modest application of that, but another way to get more carbon into the soil and reduce the pressure from water and nutrients from those trees in the competition. I know the root system is way out into the lawn, but it's a good start. So that poor Scots pine there, to mimic more of the forest. And what about digging up soil? The first thing that happens, what's the first thing that comes out of that soil when we start digging it up and moving it over? Where's the carbon go? Does it stay inside? Carbon, does it leave or does it stay? Yeah, it gets burned off essentially, right? And the microbes will die with the air exposure, the sun exposure. So there's kind of this death and this explosion of nutrients that become available, like, nitrogen, but very, very, very short term, and then you've got a dead soil. And so this is, where no-till comes from. The old organic matter also kind of burns up in the atmosphere too. So we lose a lot of carbon in the soil when we do that, so it makes mulching really important. The addition of wood and bark to our soil is really, really important. Using annuals less and perennials more, diverse plants, planting more plants, and leaving more debris. Can you do it? Can you tell this kind of a short form of a story in a few sentences and keep your customer engaged? Is there enough here to sort of be that positive change and that educator in the arboriculture industry? I hope so. This is what front yards are starting to look like in Thunder Bay. Look at all those carbohydrates moving into the soil, feeding the microbiome. We mow our leaves and put them on our gardens. Amazing source of carbon into the soil. A lot healthier soils and a lot more worms and aeration and all that good stuff. But plants were meant to grow with their fungal partners. And plants were meant to grow together. And this is a beech and a maple, and I'm not going to insult I know this is terrible. Like, you would never want to see this, but just to sort of be the example that if we can get more trees growing together and more neighborhoods of trees growing together where the trees can network and they can have that fungal network below them, it can be amazing. It's getting hotter. When it gets too hot, stomates close. When stomates close, plants cannot photosynthesize. If they're not photosynthesizing, they're not growing. They're not putting out secondary defense compounds. We need more trees. This is the city of Windsor. Look how many trees they're planting all together. There's going to be beautiful networks. Keeping the grass longer is going to go a long way in increasing carbohydrates into the soil. And lastly, clover lawns. This is not a new concept. My dad has had the original clover lawn in Bolton, Ontario since 1975. I know I used to mow it, but fixes nitrogen from the air into the soil and incredible carbohydrates back into the soil. And I just wanted to leave you with this last thing. For anybody who I think it's all of you, who love plants and microbes and everything as much as I do, there's this really neat device called Music of the Plants. It was developed by a team of researchers from Italy. And if you want to just throw that song on, I'm going to throw that song on. This is really neat. I'm just going to... This is where you can get this on Spotify. See if this will play. They hook up an electrode to the leaf and another electrode into the soil. The difference in the signal, they wrote an algorithm that equates it to a musical note. So all these notes you're hearing are created by about 25 trees and all the organisms in the soil all together at the same time. And they call it the music of the plants. If you put your headphones on, you don't need any psilocybin. You're going on a trip, I promise you. Beautiful meditation music is available to you. Thank you so much.